On the 15th of April, 1452, in the quiet hours before dawn, a boy was born in the rugged heart of the Tuscan hills. His arrival was not marked by the joyful ringing of church bells, nor was his name entered into the official parish registers of legitimate marriages. He was born in a stone house on a slope overlooking silver-green olive groves, a child of a fleeting and perhaps accidental union. His mother was Caterina, a 25-year-old peasant girl from the village of Anciano. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a successful notary and a representative of a respected family of Florentine jurists. At the moment of the birth, Piero was already betrothed to Albiera Amadori, a woman from a proper family who could bring respectable connections and a significant dowry. The infant was named Leonardo. His existence was recorded in the family papers of his grandfather Antonio, with a laconic note describing him as a grandson born of Piero, his son. There was no mention of the mother. Caterina's fate was decided quickly. In that same year, she was married off to a local kiln worker named Antonio di Piero Butti, a man of rough character who took her without a dowry, fully aware of her history. Leonardo remained in the house of his grandfather. Thus, his destiny was shaped before he even learned to walk. He was the illegitimate son of a notary, forever deprived of the right to inherit the family business, to hold public office, or to receive a formal university education. In the eyes of the law he existed, but he belonged to no social class entirely. The house of Antonio da Vinci stood on the edge of the village, surrounded by vineyards and olive terraces. From this vantage point, a breathtaking view opened onto the valley of the Arno River, stretching toward Florence, and onto the chain of hills covered with chestnuts and oaks. The boy grew up in this space of greenery and stone under the care of his grandfather, his uncle Francesco, and his young stepmother Albiera, who never bore Piero any heirs and treated the stepson with a cold tolerance. His father appeared rarely, preoccupied with his legal affairs in Florence, and every visit was formal and brief. Piero sought only to check if the boy was alive and healthy, ensuring he required no expenses beyond what was strictly necessary. Leonardo learned to read and write in the Italian vernacular and mastered basic arithmetic, but Latin, the language of law, medicine, and philosophy, remained closed to him. Universities accepted only legitimate sons. Even the guilds of artists and craftsmen preferred boys with a clean lineage. He could have become a simple apprentice, a servant, or a petty trader. However, grandfather Antonio, a man of gentle disposition, saw something unusual in the child. He allowed Leonardo to wander the countryside with pieces of charcoal and sheets of paper that the notary brought home from his office. The boy drew everything he saw: the graceful curve of a grapevine, the gnarled structure of old oak bark, and even the skeletal remains of a dead lizard found under a stone. He could sit for hours by a stream, watching how the water moved around obstacles, forming vortices and intricate swirls. He caught dragonflies to examine the transparency of their wings against the sunlight. He climbed the high cliffs to see how a hawk spread its feathers before a dive. Nature was his textbook without words, written in forms, movement, and light. He did not memorize with words, but with lines. Drawing became his primary way of understanding the hidden machinery of the world. Uncle Francesco, the younger brother of Piero, who was unburdened by career ambitions and spent his days in idleness among the vineyards, was the only one who truly understood his nephew. He took Leonardo on long walks through the hills, showing him where rare herbs grew, where one could find ancient shells fossilized in limestone, and where fox dens were hidden. Francesco asked no questions and demanded no explanations. He simply walked beside the boy, allowing him to see and to think. These walks were the only moments when Leonardo did not feel like an outcast, but like a discoverer. By the age of 12, his drawings had become the subject of village gossip. A local priest asked him to draw an image of St. Anthony for a small chapel, and was astonished by the anatomical precision of the hands. One of the neighbors commissioned a painting on a wooden shield and received an image of Medusa so realistic that he recoiled at the sight of the snakes in her hair. Rumors of this talent eventually reached Piero in Florence. The notary, being a practical man, realized that an illegitimate son could become a source of income if his talent was channeled into a profitable trade. Artists in Florence earned well, especially those who could satisfy the tastes of the Medici and other wealthy families. In the spring of 1466, the 14-year-old Leonardo was brought to Florence and placed as an apprentice with Andrea del Verrocchio, the owner of one of the most successful workshops in the city. Piero paid for the training, agreed on the terms, and left his son at the gates of the bottega on Via del Agnolo before returning to his office. The boy remained alone with a bundle of clothes and a few drawings in a city that breathed ambition, money, and glory. Florence met him with the scent of paint, gold leaf, horse manure, and river dampness. Narrow streets between high stone houses, squares with marble fountains, and markets trading in pigments and canvases defined his new world. The city was an open-air workshop where art was not just inspiration, but a craft and a business. Verrocchio's workshop was a two-story building where the hierarchy was rigid. Younger apprentices ground pigments and washed brushes, while the seniors worked on the master's commissions. Leonardo started from the very bottom, his hands smelling of linseed oil and turpentine. He watched every movement and every technical trick of the master, absorbing the knowledge that would soon make him the greatest mind of his age. The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio was a factory of beauty, a place where art was forged with the sweat of labor and the precision of a merchant. For young Leonardo, these years were a transition from the wild freedom of the Tuscan hills to the disciplined geometry of the Renaissance. Verrocchio was a master of many trades, a goldsmith, a sculptor, and a painter who commanded the respect of the most powerful families in Florence. He did not teach his pupils to wait for divine inspiration. He taught them the chemistry of pigments, the physics of bronze casting, and the mathematical laws of perspective. Leonardo spent his days grinding minerals into fine powders, mixing them with egg yolk or linseed oil, and preparing wooden panels with layers of smooth gesso. He moved from the humble tasks of a servant to the skilled work of an assistant, and soon his talent began to eclipse even that of his master. The turning point came during the creation of a large altar painting, The Baptism of Christ, commissioned for the Church of San Salvi. Verrocchio allowed his 17-year-old apprentice to paint the figure of an angel in the left corner of the composition. Leonardo did not simply follow the established style. He brought something entirely new to the panel. Using oil glazes to create soft transitions, he painted an angel that seemed to breathe. The light reflected in the eyes, the subtle flush on the cheeks, and the intricate curls of hair suggested a living presence rather than a religious icon. His fellow accused included men with powerful connections. Leonardo Tornabuoni was related to the Medici family, and Bartolomeo di Pasquino was the son of a wealthy wool merchant. Their lawyers acted immediately, filing petitions about the lack of evidence and the questionable nature of anonymous claims. Leonardo, however, stood alone. His father could offer only modest legal assistance, and the illegitimacy of his birth meant he had no political shield to protect him. He faced the very real prospect of being the sole victim of the trial, a sacrifice to satisfy the city's thirst for moral order. However, the lack of witnesses eventually turned the tide. Jacopo Saltarelli denied the accusations during his own interrogation, and without a second witness or a confession, the case began to crumble. On the 7th of June, 1476, the charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. All 4 men were released with a stern warning to lead a pious life and avoid bad company. Formally, Leonardo was innocent, but practically he was a marked man. His name was entered into the registers of the night office, meaning that any future suspicion could lead him back to the prisoner's dock. He emerged from the Palazzo Vecchio into the bright June sunlight. But the world looked different to him. The city of Florence, which had once been his stage, now felt like a labyrinth of spies and judgmental eyes. The return to the workshop was silent. Verrocchio said nothing, merely nodding toward an unfinished commission, but the whispers of the other apprentices followed Leonardo everywhere. The trust he had built with his talent was now undermined by the stain of suspicion. In the Florence of the late 15th century, an artist could be a genius, but if his reputation was tied to the sin against nature, the doors of the great houses began to close. The church was hesitant to trust the painting of sacred altars to a man accused of such acts. Leonardo became more cautious, retreating into a shell of secrecy. He stopped attending the gatherings of young artists in taverns and avoided close relationships within the workshop. His sketches of beautiful male bodies, which had once lay openly on his desk, were now hidden in locked chests. This experience gave birth to his famous mirror writing, a way to protect his thoughts from prying eyes. It also shaped his fascination with the human form as a biological machine, rather than a romantic ideal. He observed women with the detached eye of a naturalist, painting Madonnas who were perfect in form, but often lacked earthly warmth. Men, however, remained his focus of study. He drew athletes and rowers on the Arno, capturing every muscle and tendon. These drawings served a dual purpose. Officially, they were anatomical studies, but unofficially, they were a way for him to look at what he could not openly desire without risking his life. By the age of 28, Leonardo was a master with his own workshop, but he was a man in exile within his own city. He realized that in Florence, his future was limited by his past. He began to look beyond the Tuscan hills toward the courts of distant dukes and tyrants, who might value his genius more than his reputation. The seeds of his departure were sown, and the path to Milan began to open. Вот 3 глава вашего исторического повествования, переведенная на английский язык. Она посвящена переезду Леонардо в Милан, его знаменитому письму к Людовико Сфорца и первым годам службы при дворе. Требования соблюдены. Объем более 5000 знаков, отсутствие сокращений, все числа и даты прописаны словами. Part 3. A letter to the tyrant. In the spring of 1482, 30-year-old Leonardo da Vinci turned his back on Florence. The decision had been maturing for a long time, fueled by a sense of stagnation and the lingering shadows of past scandals. The catalyst for his departure was the news that the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro because of his dark complexion and black hair, was seeking artists and engineers to bolster the prestige and power of his court. Milan was the wealthiest city of northern Italy, a bustling center of arms production, textiles, and jewelry. The fortress of the Sforza family loomed over the city as a symbol of absolute authority, capable of financing the most ambitious and expensive projects. Leonardo understood that this was his chance to start anew, far from the Florentine gossip and the cold stares of those who remembered his trial. He did not travel empty-handed. Before his journey, he composed a letter to the Duke that was destined to become one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the Renaissance. It was a recommendation and a manifesto of his own capabilities. Written on several sheets of thick paper, in a neat hand, the letter listed his skills in 10 distinct points. Remarkably, he did not begin with art. He began with war. The first point stated that he could build light and strong bridges, capable of withstanding the passage of an army and easily dismantled to evade a pursuing enemy. The second promised the ability to drain the moats of besieged fortresses and create scaling ladders for storming walls. The third described mortars of a special design, convenient for hurling stones. The fourth offered covered wagons, protected from enemy arrows and capable of breaking the ranks of infantry. The fifth point spoke of underground passages for infiltrating besieged cities, while the sixth promised ships capable of resisting fire and artillery. Only at the very end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, did Leonardo mention that in times of peace, he could work as an architect, designing public and private buildings and projecting canals for irrigation. And in the very last line, he added that he was capable of painting as well as any other master. Art was mentioned as a mere supplement, an apology for occupying space in a list of serious, life-saving skills. This letter demonstrated a keen understanding of what the rulers of the late 15th century desired. Italy was fragmented into warring states. Milan fought with Venice, Florence intrigued against Rome, and Naples threatened them all. Every duke and every tyrant needed engineers capable of strengthening cities and creating weapons that gave an advantage in battle. Artists were a luxury, but engineers were a necessity. Leonardo traveled across the Apennines in the early summer heat. The journey took several days. He carried with him the letter, dozens of drawings, blueprints for machines that existed only on paper, and a silver lute in the shape of a horse's skull, which he had crafted himself. Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, had sent him partly as a diplomatic gift to Sforza. But for Leonardo, this was not an embassy. It was an escape. He left behind a city where he was known too well and traveled to a place where he could become whoever he chose to be. Milan greeted him with the smell of hot metal and coal. The city was larger than Florence, rougher and wealthier. There was no delicate elegance of Tuscan squares here, but there was an overwhelming sense of raw power. The Sforza castle was a city within a city, surrounded by moats and walls several meters thick. His audience with the Duke took place a few days after his arrival. Leonardo was led into a hall where Ludovico sat surrounded by advisors, secretaries, and courtiers. The Duke was 30 years old, of medium height and sturdy build, with a piercing gaze and a rapid manner of speaking that often interrupted his interlocutors. Leonardo handed him the letter. Ludovico read it, passed it to a secretary, and asked several pointed questions about the construction of mortars and bridges, then demanded to see the drawings. The blueprints made an immediate impression. The machines drawn by Leonardo looked convincing. Covered battle wagons with slots for cannons, multi-barreled guns capable of firing volleys, and giant crossbows for hurling heavy arrows seemed like the future of warfare. Whether they were actually feasible was not the question. What mattered was that they looked possible. Ludovico nodded, stated that he would take Leonardo into his service, and then unexpectedly asked if the artist knew how to organize festivals. Milan was preparing for the wedding of the Duke's nephew to Isabella of Aragon, and the festivities were meant to demonstrate the wealth of the Sforza family to the ambassadors of foreign states. The court required theatrical productions, mechanical wonders, triumphal arches, and elaborate costumes. Leonardo replied that he indeed possessed these skills. Ludovico smiled and told him to begin there. Thus began his Milanese service. Leonardo received a salary, a workshop in one of the buildings near the fortress, and the title of court engineer and artist. However, for the first few years, he worked not on war machines or grand paintings, but on the choreography of courtly life. He designed mechanical lions that could open their chests to reveal lilies and created rotating stages for theatrical performances. He drew costumes for masquerades and composed riddles and rebuses for the intellectual games of the courtiers. This was the work of a talented craftsman, but not yet of a genius. Leonardo understood this and remained patient. He knew that at court, one must first prove utility before being granted serious commissions. He observed Ludovico, studying his character and learning what the Duke truly desired. The Duke was an ambitious man who dreamed of turning Milan into the cultural capital of Italy, overshadowing Florence by attracting the best artists and scientists. Yet he also lived in constant preparation for war. Leonardo proposed the creation of a colossal bronze horse, a monument to honor Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. The statue was to be the largest in the world. Ludovico approved the idea, and Leonardo began the work. He studied the anatomy of horses, made hundreds of sketches, and calculated the technology of casting 70 tons of bronze. This project would occupy him for years, constantly delayed as he sought a perfection that seemed always out of reach. In the spring of 1482, 30-year-old Leonardo da Vinci turned his back on Florence. The decision had been maturing for a long time, fueled by a sense of stagnation and the lingering shadows of past scandals. The catalyst for his departure was the news that the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro because of his dark complexion and black hair, was seeking artists and engineers to bolster the prestige and power of his court. Milan was the wealthiest city of northern Italy, a bustling center of arms production, textiles, and jewelry. The fortress of the Sforza family loomed over the city as a symbol of absolute authority, capable of financing the most ambitious and expensive projects. Leonardo understood that this was his chance to start anew, far from the Florentine gossip and the cold stares of those who remembered his trial. he did not travel empty-handed. Before his journey, he composed a letter to the Duke that was destined to become one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the Renaissance. It was a recommendation and a manifesto of his own capabilities. Written on several sheets of thick paper in a neat hand, the letter listed his skills in 10 distinct points. Remarkably, he did not begin with art. He began with war. The first point stated that he could build light and strong bridges, capable of withstanding the passage of an army and easily dismantled to evade a pursuing enemy. The second promised the ability to drain the moats of besieged fortresses and create scaling ladders for storming walls. The third described mortars of a special design, convenient for hurling stones. The fourth offered covered wagons, protected from enemy arrows and capable of breaking the ranks of infantry. The fifth point spoke of underground passages for infiltrating besieged cities, while the sixth promised ships capable of resisting fire and artillery. Only at the very end of the letter, almost as an afterthought, did Leonardo mention that in times of peace, he could work as an architect, designing public and private buildings and projecting canals for irrigation. And in the very last line, he added that he was capable of painting as well as any other master. Art was mentioned as a mere supplement, an apology for occupying space in a list of serious, life-saving skills. This letter demonstrated a keen understanding of what the rulers of the late 15th century desired. Italy was fragmented into warring states. Milan fought with Venice, Florence intrigued against Rome, and Naples threatened them all. Every duke and every tyrant needed engineers capable of strengthening cities and creating weapons that gave an advantage in battle. Artists were a luxury, but engineers were a necessity. Leonardo traveled across the Apennines in the early summer heat. The journey took several days. He carried with him the letter, dozens of drawings, blueprints for machines that existed only on paper, and a silver lute in the shape of a horse's skull, which he had crafted himself. Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, had sent him partly as a diplomatic gift to Sforza. But for Leonardo, this was not an embassy. It was an escape. He left behind a city where he was known too well and traveled to a place where he could become whoever he chose to be. Milan greeted him with the smell of hot metal and coal. The city was larger than Florence, rougher and wealthier. There was no delicate elegance of Tuscan squares here, but there was an overwhelming sense of raw power. The Sforza castle was a city within a city, surrounded by moats and walls several meters thick. His audience with the Duke took place a few days after his arrival. Leonardo was led into a hall where Ludovico sat surrounded by advisors, secretaries, and courtiers. The Duke was 30 years old, of medium height and sturdy build, with a piercing gaze and a rapid manner of speaking that often interrupted his interlocutors. Leonardo handed him the letter. Ludovico read it, passed it to a secretary, and asked several pointed questions about the construction of mortars and bridges, then demanded to see the drawings. The blueprints made an immediate impression. The machines drawn by Leonardo looked convincing. Covered battle wagons with slots for cannons, multi-barreled guns capable of firing volleys, and giant crossbows for hurling heavy arrows seemed like the future of warfare. Whether they were actually feasible was not the question. What mattered was that they looked possible. Ludovico nodded, stated that he would take Leonardo into his service. and then unexpectedly asked if the artist knew how to organize festivals. Milan was preparing for the wedding of the Duke's nephew to Isabella of Aragon, and the festivities were meant to demonstrate the wealth of the Sforza family to the ambassadors of foreign states. The court required theatrical productions, mechanical wonders, triumphal arches, and elaborate costumes. Leonardo replied that he indeed possessed these skills. Ludovico smiled and told him to begin there. Thus began his Milanese service. Leonardo received a salary, a workshop in one of the buildings near the fortress, and the title of court engineer and artist. However, for the first few years, he worked not on war machines or grand paintings, but on the choreography of courtly life. He designed mechanical lions that could open their chests to reveal lilies and created rotating stages for theatrical performances. He drew costumes for masquerades and composed riddles and rebuses for the intellectual games of the courtiers. This was the work of a talented craftsman, but not yet of a genius. Leonardo understood this and remained patient. He knew that at court, one must first prove utility before being granted serious commissions. He observed Ludovico, studying his character and learning what the Duke truly desired. The Duke was an ambitious man who dreamed of turning Milan into the cultural capital of Italy, overshadowing Florence by attracting the best artists and scientists. Yet he also lived in constant preparation for war. Leonardo proposed the creation of a colossal bronze horse, a monument to honor Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. The statue was to be the largest in the world. Ludovico approved the idea, and Leonardo began the work. He studied the anatomy of horses, made hundreds of sketches, and calculated the technology of casting 70 tons of bronze. This project would occupy him for years, constantly delayed as he sought a perfection that seemed always out of reach. The monks of the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie complained about Leonardo almost from the first day of his work. He would arrive at dawn, climb the wooden scaffolding against the wall of the refectory, and stand for hours staring at the unfinished painting, only to leave without having touched a brush. Sometimes he would appear at noon in the blistering heat, apply 2 or 3 strokes to one of the figures, and vanish for another week. The prior of the monastery wrote frequent letters of complaint to Ludovico Sforza, demanding that the artist work like a proper hired craftsman from sunrise to sunset, without being distracted by idle thoughts. Leonardo explained that painting of this level required not just the work of the hands, but the work of the mind. He had to find faces for each apostle, to study how a human being reacts to a sudden and terrible revelation, and to understand the psychology of both betrayal and loyalty. He wandered the streets of Milan, observing faces in the crowd and sketching expressions of surprise, anger, and fear. He visited taverns where drunken men argued, memorizing the frantic movements of their hands. He sought a model for Judas in the dark corners of the city's prisons, among criminals awaiting execution. The prior continued to insist on a faster pace, until Leonardo, irritated by the constant reminders, famously remarked that if he were hurried any further, he would paint the face of Judas using the prior himself as a model. The threats of the monk ceased, but the work continued to move slowly because Leonardo sought perfection in every detail, and perfection always remained one step ahead of what he had already achieved. By the year 1498, the painting was nearly finished. 13 figures sat at a long table, frozen in a moment of profound shock. Christ sat in the center, calm and already knowing the outcome. The apostles were arranged on either side, divided into groups of 3, each group linked by a shared movement, but each figure remaining distinct. Peter held a knife, John leaned away in sorrow, and Judas sat in shadow, clutching the bag of 30 pieces of silver. The perspective of the room led the eye into the depth of the image, creating an illusion that the space of the refectory continued into the painting itself. The work became famous even before it was completed, and artists traveled from other cities just to see how Leonardo had solved an old problem in an entirely new way. However, even then, it was noticeable that the paint was beginning to flake off the wall. His experiment with technique, using tempera and oil on a dry wall instead of the traditional fresco on wet plaster, had failed. A masterpiece intended for the ages began to crumble only a few years after its completion. Parallel to his work in the monastery, Leonardo was engaged in something he spoke of to no one. At night, he descended into the basements of the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, where the bodies of the deceased were kept while awaiting burial. He had obtained permission from the hospital physician, Marcantonio della Torre, who himself was interested in anatomy and understood the value of precise knowledge about the structure of the human body. The dissections were carried out by the flickering light of torches in cold stone rooms where the smell of decay mingled with the thick smoke of resin. Leonardo worked quickly, knowing that a body begins to change only a few hours after death. He opened the chest cavity to study the heart, lungs, and major vessels, and he cut into the limbs to expose the muscles, tendons, and ligaments. He dissected eyes to understand the optical system and opened skulls to examine the structure of the brain. Every dissection was accompanied by detailed drawings. Leonardo drew what he saw with a precision that was unavailable to the anatomists of his time. He depicted muscles in cross-section to show the direction of their fibers, drew bones indicating the points of attachment for tendons, and created diagrams of the circulatory system. His drawings were so accurate that 300 years later, they would still be used in medical textbooks. The Church forbade the dissection of human bodies, considering it an insult to God's creation, and such studies were conducted in secret at the risk of being accused of sacrilege. Leonardo knew this, but he continued. He believed that understanding the machinery of the human body was as necessary for an artist as the knowledge of perspective. One could not correctly draw what one did not understand. The skin, he believed, hid a machine built according to the laws of mechanics and geometry. He dissected more than 30 bodies during his years in Milan. Elderly men who had died of disease, executed criminals, and the nameless poor. Once, he dissected the body of a 100-year-old man who had died peacefully in his sleep and discovered that the vessels of his heart had hardened and narrowed. Leonardo concluded that old age was linked to changes in the circulatory system, providing one of the first descriptions of atherosclerosis in medical history. His manuscripts filled with drawings of intestines, bones, and muscles, written in his characteristic mirror script from right to left to hide his findings from prying eyes. He planned to create a complete atlas of the human body, a book that would explain to both artists and doctors how a human being is constructed. This double life required immense caution. By day, he was the courtly artist working on a religious masterpiece in a monastery. By night, He was the anatomist, breaking the prohibitions of the church. This contradiction did not trouble him. He saw no conflict between faith and knowledge, believing that God created man according to specific laws, and to study those laws was to comprehend the divine plan. Anatomy was not blasphemy to him, but a form of worship through the understanding of the perfection of creation. However, not everyone shared his view. Rumors of his nighttime visits to the morgue reached the ears of certain monks, who whispered that the artist was communing with the dead or seeking the secrets of life in the rotting of flesh. The prior of Santa Maria delle Grazie once hinted that such activities could lead to an accusation of witchcraft, to which Leonardo replied that he studied anatomy only to ensure the truthfulness of the apostles' bodies. The explanation was accepted, but the distrust remained. By the end of the 1490s, Leonardo had a reputation as a brilliant but strange master, whose mind seemed to dwell in worlds that others feared to enter. Among the ladies of the Milanese court of Ludovico Sforza, Cecilia Gallerani stood out not only for her beauty, but for her intellect. She was 17 years old when she became the mistress of the Duke, yet she was far more than a passing fancy. She was highly educated, fluent in Latin, wrote poetry, and participated in the philosophical disputes that were held in the grand halls of the fortress. Ludovico commissioned Leonardo to paint her portrait around the year 1489. At that time, the artist was 37, and the girl was barely 18. Leonardo spent several months working on the painting, capturing her essence in a way that was revolutionary for the era. Cecilia posed in a room where the light fell from the side, creating soft shadows across her face. Leonardo asked for a white ermine to be brought to the session, a symbol of purity and a clever pun on her surname, Gallerani, which echoed the Greek word for the animal. The young woman held the creature in her arms, turning her head as if someone had called her at that very moment. She was depicted not in profile, as was the custom, but in a three-quarter turn that created a sense of movement, a captured moment in time. During their sessions, they spoke often. Cecilia asked questions about the techniques of painting and how the artist achieved such realism. Leonardo explained his theories of light and shadow, telling her that the eye perceives not just form, but the very air that exists between forms. He found these conversations engaging, for she was one of the few women at court capable of discussing philosophy or science. Yet it was an intellectual interest and a respect for her mind that bound them. Leonardo felt none of the passion that men usually felt for beautiful young women. He studied her face as an object of representation, analyzing the proportions and the curve of her neck with the cold eye of a scientist. Another woman who persistently sought Leonardo's attention was Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua. She considered herself a supreme patroness of the arts, collecting paintings and ancient sculptures. Her study was filled with works by the finest artists of Italy, but she lacked a piece by Leonardo.
Yes, Maestro.
They met in 1499 when Leonardo fled Milan and stayed in Mantua for several months. Isabella immediately commissioned her portrait. Leonardo agreed and created a magnificent preparatory drawing in charcoal and red chalk. The drawing was brilliant, showing Isabella in profile with a calm and commanding gaze. However, this was only a sketch, and the Marchioness demanded a finished oil painting. Leonardo promised to complete it later and left. Years passed, but the promise was never kept. Isabella wrote him letters and sent messengers, offering money and patronage. But Leonardo remained evasive. He was not interested in painting powerful women who demanded icons of their own greatness. He sought mysteries, faces that hid more than they revealed. This search for the unspoken led him to the commission of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. Around 1503, the merchant asked him to paint a portrait of his third wife, Lisa Gherardini. She was 24 years old, a mother of several children, and led a quiet life in a house on Via della Stufa.
Where were you that night?
There was nothing remarkable about her biography.
Can anyone verify?
She was an ordinary Florentine bourgeoise. Yet, once Leonardo began the portrait, he could not stop. He worked on Lisa for years, carrying the portrait with him from city to city, constantly changing the layers of paint, adjusting the expression of the face, the hands, and the background. Francesco del Giocondo never received the painting he had ordered. Leonardo would not part with it for any amount of money, and it remained with him until the very end of his life. What did he see in that face that others did not? Perhaps it was the very ambiguity of her expression, a smile that was not quite a smile, and a gaze that seemed to look through the viewer. Lisa did not pose. She existed in a world of her own thoughts. To create this illusion of life, Leonardo used his famous technique of sfumato, a blurring of the boundaries between light and shade so subtle that it was impossible to tell where one form ended and another began. He returned to the portrait over and over for more than 10 years, adding transparent glazes to correct the skin tone and the curve of the lips. The background changed several times, moving from a room with a window to a fantastic landscape of jagged mountains and winding rivers that seemed to exist outside of time and geography. His contemporaries did not understand his obsession. The client had not received the work, no money had been paid, and the purpose of continuing the labor was unclear. But for Leonardo, this was not a commercial transaction. It was an attempt to achieve perfection in the depiction of the human face, and to capture the very presence of a soul on a wooden panel. Women in his life remained shadows, objects of study, and models for his divine Madonnas, but they were never objects of his desire. He could spend hours analyzing the structure of a female neck, or the anatomy of a womb in a dissected body, but his gaze was always that of the scientist. He saw in women the perfection of natural form and the mystery of fertility, but the warmth of romantic love was something he reserved for the secrets of his journals. The Mona Lisa became the culmination of his life's work, a testament to a man who could paint the wind and the light, but struggled to find a place for himself in the world of human emotions. In the summer of 1490, a 10-year-old boy was brought to Leonardo's workshop in Milan. His name was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, the son of a poor peasant from the village of Oreno near Milan. The father hoped to apprentice his son to the famous master, believing that a craft would provide the boy a better life than working in the fields. Leonardo looked at the child and agreed to take him, requiring no payment for his education. The boy was beautiful, with an androgynous grace that is often seen in children before the onset of adulthood. He had golden curling hair, large eyes, and delicate features. Leonardo soon gave him the nickname Salai, which meant the little devil or the imp. The nickname proved to be prophetic. 2 days after arriving at the workshop, Salai stole a silver stylus that Leonardo used for drawing on prepared paper. A week later, Money disappeared from a purse left on a table.
I will, grandfather.
A month later, expensive leather bought for binding manuscripts vanished. Leonardo kept a meticulous record of these thefts in his notebooks, listing the stolen items and their exact value. The entries were detailed, almost pedantic, yet no punishment followed. Salai was not only a thief, he lied when confronted, broke tools, spilled expensive pigments, and ruined prepared canvases. He fought with other apprentices, was rude to clients, and disappeared for days at a time, without explanation. Any other master would have thrown such a pupil out in the first week. Leonardo not only tolerated him, but bought him expensive clothes, shoes, and jewelry. In his records from 1491, Leonardo listed expenses for Salai: a cloak, 6 shirts, 3 pairs of stockings, a pair of shoes, and a belt with a silver buckle. The sums were significant for an apprentice who brought no apparent benefit to the workshop. The other assistants grumbled, unable to understand why a thief enjoyed such patronage. The explanation was one that no one dared to speak aloud. Leonardo drew Salai constantly. There were dozens of sketches in his notebooks, showing the profile with curling hair, the face in 3/4 view with a thoughtful expression, and the naked body of the youth in various poses. As the boy matured, the drawings became more explicit. Nude figures of the young man lying on his side and figures in erotic poses were executed with the same care as anatomical diagrams for scientific treatises. Leonardo hid these drawings in a separate folder kept in a locked chest. To show them was dangerous. The memory of the Florentine trial of 1476 had not faded. Sodomy was punishable by death, and even a hint of such a relationship between master and pupil could lead to a denunciation. Yet Leonardo continued to draw because he could not stop.
Tell me again. Where were
Salai
you?
remained with him for
I was
30
at home,
years.
alone.
From a beautiful
Can anyone
boy,
verify that?
he turned
No.
into a handsome
It was
youth
just me.
and then into a middle-aged man. But he never truly became an artist. His works were mediocre copies of his teacher's paintings, lacking both originality and skill. He was not interested in science, read no books, and asked no questions about nature or art. His interests were money, clothing, and entertainment. Leonardo knew this and endured it. He bought Salai expensive tunics made of velvet, hats with feathers, and rings with precious stones. He even bequeathed him a vineyard near Milan in 1513, which had been gifted to Leonardo by Ludovico Sforza.
Yes, maestro.
He tolerated the mistresses Salai brought to the workshop and the debts that had to be paid. He endured the mockery of courtiers who saw how the famous artist danced to the tune of a beautiful idler. What kept Leonardo in this relationship? Perhaps Salai was the only person with whom he allowed himself to be weak. With dukes and cardinals, he remained pointedly dignified. With pupils, he maintained the distance of a master. With clients, he was polite and evasive. Only with Salai could he be who he truly was, a man who desired the beauty of the male body and who needed closeness, even if it was one-sided and exploitative. Salai served as the model for several major paintings. It is widely believed that Leonardo used his features for the image of John the Baptist, painted around 1513. The youth with long, curling hair, naked to the waist, pointing a finger upward with an ambiguous smile on his lips, was an image so androgynous and sensual that contemporaries found it indecent for a religious subject. But Leonardo had not painted a saint. He had painted Salai in the guise of a saint. The same model was used for the painting known as Bacchus. The young god of wine, sitting in a forest, semi-nude with a vine and a cup, shared the same curling hair, the same delicate features, and the same double-edged sensuality. Leonardo was not creating religious art or mythology. He was creating portraits of his own obsession. Their relationship was no secret to those close to him. Francesco Melzi, another pupil of Leonardo who came from a noble Milanese family and treated the master with deep reverence, hated Salai. He saw how the younger man manipulated the aging artist, wheedled money out of him, and sold his drawings without permission. Melzi was educated, refined, and devoted to art and his teacher. Salai was beautiful, insolent, and thought only of himself. Leonardo kept both of them near him, but in different ways. Melzi was the heir to his intellectual labor, while Salai was the source of an irrational attraction. In later entries, Leonardo called Salai a thief, a liar, a stubborn person, and a glutton. He listed his faults with the same scrupulousness he used to describe anatomy or the mechanics of bird flight. Yet he had no intention of parting with him. When Leonardo accepted the invitation of the French king in 1516 and moved to France, Salai did not go with him. He remained in Milan in the house with the vineyard he had received. This was their only separation in 30 years. Salai lived for only a few years after Leonardo's death, selling the drawings and paintings left in his possession. He died in 1524 under mysterious circumstances, perhaps killed by robbers. He was 44 years old. The man who for 3 decades had lived off the affection of a genius vanished ingloriously, leaving behind a few mediocre paintings and a multitude of drawings upon which his own image was forever preserved. In the autumn of 1499, the French army of King Louis XII crossed the Alps and marched upon Milan. Ludovico Sforza, who had ruled the city for 17 years, failed to organize a proper defense. His mercenaries deserted, his allies betrayed him, and his treasury was empty. On the 2nd of September, French troops entered the city without a fight. Ludovico fled to Germany, leaving behind his fortress, his palace, and everyone who had served him faithfully. Leonardo was in his workshop when news of the French approach reached him. He was 47 years old, and 17 of those years had been spent in the service of the Sforza family. He had designed festivals and paintings, engineered machines, and labored over the colossal equestrian statue that was never cast. Now, his patron was gone. The new masters of the city could confiscate the property of anyone associated with the previous regime. In the courtyard of the workshop stood the clay model of the monument to Francesco Sforza. It was 7 meters high, depicting a horse on its hind legs, with a rider in armor. It was the work of 17 years. 70 tons of bronze were supposed to have been used for the final casting. But Ludovico had postponed the decision for years, citing the needs of the war. The bronze had gone to make cannons. The model remained clay. French archers, stationed near the workshop, discovered the giant figure and decided to use it for target practice. They shot at it with bows and crossbows, piercing the clay and knocking out large chunks. Within a few days, the model was so mutilated that restoration became impossible. The autumn rains completed the destruction. The clay softened, crumbled, and turned into a shapeless heap on the pavement. Leonardo stood before the remains of his greatest Milanese project and realized that 17 years of labor had been destroyed in a matter of days by random soldiers who did not even know they were shooting at the greatest sculptural vision of the age. The statue was meant to surpass everything created in bronze since antiquity.
Steady pressure.
It remained only in drawings, sketches, and calculations that filled dozens of pages of his manuscripts. This was not his first unfinished project. The altar painting for the monastery of San Donato in Florence, started in 1481, remained incomplete when he left for Milan. The Last Supper was already beginning to flake from the wall due to a failed technical experiment. Dozens of blueprints for war machines were never realized in metal. The impossibility of finishing was part of his nature. He always saw flaws in what he did and always found a way to improve, to refine, and to redo. Perfection remained unattainable because with every step forward, new horizons of imperfection opened. The French did not touch him personally. They knew of his reputation, and the new governor of Milan, Charles d'Amboise, even invited the artist to remain in service. But Leonardo realized that in a city where everything reminded him of the fall of his patron, work was impossible. He gathered his manuscripts, drawings, and several unfinished paintings and departed. The following years were a time of wandering. He went to Mantua, where the Marchioness Isabella d'Este demanded he finish her portrait, and then to Venice, where he was invited to consult on the city's defenses against the Turkish threat. He proposed a project of movable sluices capable of flooding the enemy army if they attempted to besiege the city. The project was magnificent but expensive. The Venetian Senate thanked him and declined its implementation. In the spring of 1500, Leonardo returned to Florence. The city had changed significantly during his 20-year absence. Lorenzo the Magnificent was dead, and his son Piero had been exiled. The monk Savonarola had organized bonfires of the vanities, burning paintings and books declared sinful, only to be executed himself as a heretic. Florence had become a republic, governed by a council and the gonfaloniere, Piero Soderini. Leonardo received a commission for a mural on one of the walls in the great council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio. The subject chosen was political, the Battle of Anghiari, where the Florentines defeated the Milanese in 1440. Opposite him, the young sculptor Michelangelo Buonarroti was assigned to depict the Battle of Cassina. Two of the greatest artists of the era were to work in the same hall. Competition was inevitable. Michelangelo was 29 years old, and Leonardo was 50. The young sculptor was rough, hot-tempered, and fanatically devoted to his work. He despised social conventions and lived in his workshop like a hermit. Leonardo was refined, restrained, surrounded himself with pupils, wore expensive clothes, and was more interested in science than in art. They hated each other instinctively. Michelangelo publicly called Leonardo a man who could not finish a single work, reminding him of the abandoned statue in Milan and the unfinished altarpieces. Leonardo responded with disdainful silence, considering the young upstart a talented craftsman, but not a thinker. Their cartoons for the murals became a sensation, and Florentines came to look at the preparatory drawings and debate who was better. Leonardo created a cartoon depicting a cavalry clash in the center of the composition. Horsemen, horses, banners, and swords were caught in a dynamic whirlwind, their faces distorted by the fury of battle. The motion was stunning. Every figure was in movement. Contemporaries called this work a school for artists. But when it came time to transfer the drawing to the wall, Leonardo once again began to experiment with technique. He decided to use encaustic, an ancient method of painting with heated wax pigments described in the treatises of Pliny the Elder. The method required constant heating of the wall with braziers so that the wax would fuse with the plaster. The experiment failed. The paint dripped without setting, and the image became blurred. Leonardo abandoned the work unfinished and left Florence again in 1506. Michelangelo also never completed his mural, leaving for Rome at the invitation of the Pope. Both works remained only as cartoons, which were lost a few decades later. The Great Council Hall was eventually painted by other artists. The competition of geniuses ended in nothing. In the summer of 1502, Leonardo da Vinci received an offer that any prudent man would have declined without hesitation. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, a cardinal who had traded his robes for a sword, the Duke of Valentinois, and the commander of the papal armies, was seeking a military engineer. Cesare was conquering the Romagna, a patchwork of small principalities between Tuscany and the Adriatic, absorbing them into the papal domains through force, cunning, and cold-blooded betrayal. He needed someone capable of designing fortifications, calculating the trajectories of artillery fire, and planning sieges. Leonardo was 50 years old. He had spent years at the courts of rulers observing political intrigues, betrayals, and assassinations. He understood that power possessed no morality, only interests. Cesare Borgia was the ultimate embodiment of this principle. He was a handsome 27-year-old tyrant with the manners of a prince and the conscience of a hired assassin. It was whispered that he had poisoned his own elder brother to secure secular power, that he had strangled his sister Lucrezia's husband, and that he invited allies to negotiations only to order their execution after the feast. Leonardo knew all of this and accepted the offer. On the 25th of August, 1502, Cesare Borgia issued him a safe conduct pass, instructing all fortress commanders, military leaders, and officials in the controlled territories to provide Master Leonardo, the artist and engineer, with every possible assistance. The document was composed in superlative terms, signed by the Duke, and sealed with his crest. Leonardo received a generous salary, a horse, a guard, and absolute freedom of movement. He spent the next several months traveling through the cities of Romagna, Urbino, Cesena, Forli, Imola, and Rimini. He inspected fortresses, composed topographic maps, and designed improvements for fortifications. His maps were masterpieces of precision. He used the method of triangulation to determine distances and drew plans of cities from a bird's-eye view, showing the arrangement of walls, towers, gates, and moats. These maps were not only accurate, but beautiful, executed in colored inks with meticulous attention to detail. In Cesena, he watched as Borgia dealt with his own governor, Ramiro de Lorca, whom the Duke accused of excessive cruelty toward the population. On the morning of the 26th of December, 1502, the body of Ramiro was found in the town square, cut in half, with a blood-stained sword resting nearby. Borgia had staged a public execution of his own man to pacify the citizens and demonstrate that he was a just, if terrifying, ruler. Leonardo saw the body in the square and recorded the fact in his notebooks without comment. In Senigallia, he witnessed Borgia's most famous betrayal. 4 condottieri, who commanded mercenary detachments in the Duke's army, had conspired against him. Borgia learned of this and invited them to negotiations, promising forgiveness and new contracts. On the 31st of December, the conspirators rode into the city with a small guard. Borgia met them with open arms and invited them to a feast. During the night, all four were arrested. 2 were strangled immediately, and 2 were held in prison for a few days before meeting the same fate. Leonardo was present at these events as an observer. He did not participate in conspiracies, gave no advice on political matters, and expressed no opinions on the Duke's actions. He was an engineer, and an engineer solves technical problems without asking questions of morality. If the walls of a fortress needed strengthening, he would calculate the optimal thickness and placement of bastions. If a moat around a besieged city needed to be drained, he would design a system of canals. If the range of mortars needed to be determined, he would conduct measurements and compile tables. But parallel to these technical tasks, he observed people. He saw how Borgia charmed allies and then killed them, how he promised mercy and showed cruelty, and how he used fear, generosity, and betrayal as the tools of governance. Leonardo drew portraits of soldiers, executioners, and victims. He sketched men hanging from fortress walls, corpses on battlefields, and the faces of those awaiting execution. During this time, he met Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat, who had been sent by the Republic as an observer to Borgia's court. Machiavelli was 10 years younger than Leonardo, thin, sharp-tongued, and cynical. They spoke of politics, war, and the nature of power. Machiavelli admired Borgia, seeing in him the ideal ruler who was ready for any action to achieve his goal. Later, he would describe these methods in a treatise called The Prince. Leonardo did not share this admiration. He saw in Borgia a talented tactician, but also a man doomed to fall because his power rested solely on the influence of the Pope. When Alexander VI died, the sun would lose his protection. This prediction proved to be accurate. On the 18th of August, 1503, Pope Alexander died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned. Cesare Borgia fell ill on the same day, but survived. Without his father's support, his power collapsed within months. The cities of Romagna revolted, allies betrayed him, and enemies united. The new pope, Julius II, a former adversary of the Borgias, arrested Cesare and imprisoned him. A few years later, Cesare escaped to Spain, where he died in a minor skirmish during the siege of a small castle. He was 31 years old. Leonardo had left Borgia's service long before the final crash. In the spring of 1503, he returned to Florence, carrying with him maps, fortification blueprints, and drawings of war machines. He had worked for one of the most ruthless men of the age, helping him conquer cities and kill opponents. Was it moral? Leonardo did not ask himself such a question. He was an engineer, and engineers build bridges and fortresses for those who pay. A bridge bears no responsibility for which army passes over it. But at night, in solitude, as he leafed through his records, he saw the faces of the hanged and the broken bodies in the squares. He saw how easily man kills man if it serves a political end. He realized that the humanism discussed by Florentine philosophers in the Medici gardens had no power before the sword and the poison. The world was governed not by reason, but by force. This thought did not haunt him, but it made him wonder if it was worth spending a life serving tyrants. Perhaps it was better to retreat into science, to leave the courts with their intrigues, and to focus on the study of nature, mechanics, and anatomy. There was no morality, but there was also no blood. At the end of 1513, the 61-year-old Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Rome at the invitation of Giuliano de' Medici, the younger brother of the new pope, Leo X. Giovanni de' Medici, who had taken the name Leo, was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the very ruler of Florence under whose court the young Leonardo had begun his journey. Now the Medici family ruled not only Florence but the entire Catholic Church. It seemed to be a chance to finally receive stable patronage and the opportunity to realize the ideas accumulated over decades. Leonardo settled in the Belvedere, a part of the Vatican Palace, where he was provided with a workshop, living quarters, and a monthly salary of 33 ducats. With him came 3 pupils: Salai, who was now 33 years old; Francesco Melzi, a 22-year-old youth from the Milanese nobility devoted to his master beyond measure; and Giovanni, a German master of mirrors, hired for optical experiments. Rome was a city of construction and immense ambition. Pope Julius II, Leo's predecessor, had begun the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, attracting the finest architects of the age. Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, creating frescoes that staggered contemporaries with their scale and power. Raphael Sanzio, a 30-year-old artist from Urbino, was decorating the ceremonial halls of the Vatican, becoming the darling of the papal court. Rome pulled in artists, sculptors, and architects from all over Italy like a magnet. Leonardo arrived in this city as a genius, with a reputation as a man who finished nothing. He was 61 years old, an age considered very advanced in an era when the average life expectancy barely reached 50. He moved more slowly than in his youth. His right hand had begun to weaken, possibly due to a minor stroke, but his mind remained sharp, and his interest in discovery was undiminished. Giuliano de' Medici commissioned several works from him: a portrait, a project for draining the Pontine marshes, and mechanical curiosities for courtly entertainment. Leonardo began the work, but without enthusiasm. The portrait dragged on for months. The marsh project required field research that was constantly postponed. The mechanical toys were created, but they did not evoke the wonder they had 30 years ago in Milan. He spent more of his time in anatomical research, having gained access to the hospital of Santo Spirito, where he dissected the bodies of the deceased, continuing the work begun in Milan. He dissected a bull's heart, studying the structure of the valves and attempting to understand the mechanism of blood circulation. He drew fetuses in the womb for the first time in history, showing the position of the fetus at different stages of pregnancy with anatomical precision. However, his research aroused suspicion. The German mirror maker Giovanni, who worked in his workshop, quarreled with him over money and filed a complaint with the Pope, accusing Leonardo of witchcraft and sacrilege. He claimed that the master was conducting forbidden experiments with bodies, that he was engaged in necromancy, and that his anatomical drawings served dark purposes. Leo X was not a fanatic, but he was a cautious politician. He did not want scandals at his court. Leonardo was summoned and gently but firmly forbidden from continuing dissections at the hospital. His anatomical studies were halted. This was a crushing blow. At 61, when a vast amount of experience and understanding had been accumulated, and when so little remained before the creation of a complete atlas of the human body, the work was stopped because of a jealous man's denunciation. Simultaneously, Leonardo watched as Raphael and Michelangelo received the major commissions, the money, and the fame. Raphael was young, handsome, and charming. He knew how to please patrons and worked quickly and with high quality. Michelangelo was rough and withdrawn, but his frescoes in the Sistine Chapel made such an impression that the Pope forgave him any outburst. Leonardo was old, slow, and immersed in experiments that seemed useful to no one. He felt like a stranger in this city. Rome was a city of power, money, performative piety, and hidden vice. The papal court wallowed in luxury. Cardinals kept mistresses, and bankers financed the construction of temples, while simultaneously trading in indulgences. Art here was an instrument of propaganda for the greatness of the church. Leonardo was interested in truth, not propaganda. He continued to work on the Mona Lisa, which he had carried with him for 20 years. He added the thinnest layers of paint, correcting the skin tone, the depth of the gaze, and the play of light on the face. The painting was finished in a technical sense, but not in his own perception. He saw that it could be made better, more precise, more convincing. Perfection remained unattainable. Giuliano de' Medici died in March of 1516. Leonardo lost his protector. Pope Leo, busy with politics and wars, showed no interest in the aging artist who finished nothing and spent his time in strange experiments. The salary continued to be paid, but no orders came. Leonardo understood that there was nothing more for him to do in Rome. Salai, who had lived with him for a quarter of a century, was becoming increasingly burdensome. He slept with women, fell into debt, and sold the master's drawings without permission. Leonardo was tired of these relationships, tired of beauty that gave nothing in return but irritation and disappointment. Melzi was loyal, educated, and understood the value of the scientific manuscripts, but he could not replace the closeness that Leonardo had sought his whole life and never truly found. In the second half of 1516, an invitation came from France. The young King Francis I, who had ascended the throne a year earlier, dreamed of turning his court into a center of culture, similar to those in Italy. He had heard of Leonardo, seen copies of his paintings, and knew of his reputation as the greatest artist and engineer of the age. He offered a salary of 1,000 écus per year, a castle for residence, complete freedom of creativity, and respect without demands. Leonardo accepted the offer. In Italy, he was a relic of the past, an old man who was once a genius. In France, he could become a living legend. In the autumn of 1516, he began to prepare for his departure. He packed his manuscripts, drawings, and several paintings, including the Mona Lisa. Salai decided to stay in Milan in the house with the vineyard he had received by will. Melzi went with his teacher. Leonardo was leaving Italy, the country where he had lived for 64 years, where he had created the greatest works and left dozens of unfinished projects. He was leaving without regret, because he understood that here, his time had passed. Ahead were the Alps, France, the final court, and the last 3 years of his life. In the winter of 1516, Leonardo da Vinci crossed the Alps for the last time. He was 64 years old. His right hand was nearly paralyzed following a stroke, making the journey through the mountain passes in December a grueling ordeal. He traveled on a mule, wrapped in heavy cloaks, against the biting cold. With him were Francesco Melzi and a servant, Battista de Vianis. In their saddlebags, they carried the most precious cargo: manuscripts filled with mirror writing, thousands of drawings, and 3 paintings in wooden crates lined with cloth. These paintings were chosen with care: the Mona Lisa, upon which he had labored for 15 years, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, begun in Florence and refined in Milan, and St. John the Baptist, painted with the androgynous features and ambiguous smile of Salai. These were not his largest works, but they were his most personal. Everything else remained in Italy: the unfinished frescoes, the sold paintings, and the sketches in the hands of former pupils and patrons. King Francis I met him in January of 1517 at the Château d'Amboise, on the banks of the Loire. The king was only 22 years old. Having ascended the throne after the death of Louis XII, he dreamed of making France the center of European culture. He had fought in Italy, seen the palaces of Milan and Florence, and admired Italian art with a passion. Leonardo was for him a symbol of that greatness, a living bridge to the Renaissance. The king granted the artist the Château du Clos-Lucé, a modest residence of red brick and stone, located only 200 paces from the royal palace and connected to it by an underground passage. There, Leonardo had 3 floors to himself, with a workshop on the 3rd floor featuring large windows to catch the light. He received a salary of 1,000 écus a year, servants, wood for heating, and wine from the royal cellars. Francis visited him regularly, often arriving through the secret tunnel to spend hours in conversation. Leonardo showed him drawings of machines, explained the principles of bird flight, demonstrated anatomical diagrams, and spoke of projects for canals and cities of the future. The king listened in fascination. He demanded no paintings and did not hurry the artist to complete unfinished works. For Francis, the mere presence of the genius was enough, the opportunity to talk to a man who knew more than all the courtly sages combined. Leonardo received the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, but he did not create a single new painting for Francis. His right hand, which he had used for fine work throughout his life, could no longer hold a brush with enough steadiness. With his left hand, he continued to write and draw. Mirror writing was natural for a left-handed man, but painting required the precision of the hand that now failed him. He worked on one last grand project. Francis planned to build a new city, Romorantin, which was intended to become the 2nd capital of France. Leonardo created a magnificent plan, a system of canals connecting the city to the river, wide streets, palaces, and public parks. It was a city of the future, where water was used for transport, sanitation, and defense. The blueprints occupied dozens of sheets, and the hydraulic schemes were calculated with engineering precision. Like so many of his visions, the project was never realized. Francis became distracted by wars, and the money was diverted to the army. Romorantin remained a provincial town, yet another unfinished dream in a long line of projects left on paper. The Sforza horse, the Battle of Anghiari, the complete atlas of the human body, the treatises on mechanics, all begun, all meticulously planned, but none brought to publication. Leonardo understood this and felt no bitterness. He had lived his life exactly as he wished. He had served tyrants and kings, but he had never fully sold his mind. He painted not for money or fame, but to understand how light interacts with form. He studied anatomy not for medical practice, but to grasp the divine machinery of the human body. He designed machines not for war, but to unravel the laws of mechanics. In the spring of 1519, he felt his strength fading. He composed his will on the 23rd of April in the presence of a notary and witnesses. He bequeathed all his manuscripts and drawings to Francesco Melzi, the only person capable of understanding their value and preserving them for the future. The vineyard near Milan he left to Salai, who had remained in Italy. Money, clothing, and furniture were divided among his servants and friends. He requested to be buried in the church of Saint Florentin in Amboise. On the 2nd of May, 1519, a Wednesday, Leonardo da Vinci died at the Château du Clos-Lucé. He was 67 years old. Melzi and his servants were at his side. Legend claims that King Francis held his head at the moment of his passing, but this is likely a poetic invention. The king was at another castle, several days' journey away. Leonardo was buried in the church of Saint Florentin, and his coffin was lowered into the ground of the chapel as he had requested. The will was executed precisely. Melzi took the manuscripts, more than 5,000 pages filled with calculations and inventions, back to Italy, where he spent the rest of his life trying to organize them for publication. After Melzi's death, his heirs sold parts of the papers, and some were lost. But what remained spread through the libraries and private collections of Europe. The Church of Saint Florentin was destroyed during the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, and Leonardo's grave was lost. During excavations in the 19th century, bones were found that were believed to be those of the artist and were reburied in the chapel of the Château d'Amboise. However, no proof of their authenticity exists. Perhaps the dust of the greatest genius of the Renaissance has been scattered by the wind and time. The paintings he brought to France remained in the royal collection. The Mona Lisa, St. Anne, and St. John the Baptist were purchased by Francis from the heirs for 4,000 écus. Centuries later, they found their home in the Louvre, where they attract millions of viewers who attempt to solve the smile of the woman painted 500 years ago by a man who sought perfection and never believed he had reached it. The story of Leonardo da Vinci is the story of a man who saw further than his time and therefore could not fully exist within it. He was a genius, but he was also an illegitimate son, a suspected sodomite, and a perpetual wanderer who served tyrants for the chance to think freely. He created fewer than 20 paintings, but he left thousands of drawings that preceded science by centuries. He did not finish most of his projects, but every unfinished design was a step toward understanding the world. His life was a search for truth through observation, experiment, and drawing. He died without finding the final answers, but the questions he asked continue to resonate through the centuries. How is a man constructed? How do birds fly? How does light create form? There are no final answers to these questions, but the search itself makes a human being more than just a creature born to die. Leonardo lived in that search, and that was enough for immortality.
It is a piece of history. Thanks for showing me.